officially, if I haven't already, have to embarrass myself in front of all of you. Because I have to draw, and I'm not an artist, so bear with me. If you can guess what I'm trying to draw, you should come play Pictionary at my house and be on my team. Alright, let's go.
A guitar.
No. No? No? I should. Did you say that, Alex? 10 points to you. Pictionary is on Fridays, if you're still around. But Berlin would be somewhere here. And I know Berlin's not round or that big for the matter, but just to give you an idea of what I'm about to talk about. Why have I just embarrassed myself like that in front of you? I'm hoping none of you actually know what Germany looks like also. But I've done that because we are at Checkpoint Charlie, and it's important to understand the history of what happens in Germany to understand why the checkpoint is such a monumental, must-see spot. Alright, so going way back actually, after the First World War, you have this really long and tedious document that comes out of it, super boring to read, called the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles had some important points. One, Germany was completely to blame for the First World War, and because it was their fault, they had to cut off some of the parts of the country that were important economically to the country and give it off to the to the victors of the First World War, but also they had to pay a specific amount in reparations. And this amount was so astronomically high that they only completely paid it off in 2010. And that's with some of it being forgiven, right? Coming to the end of the Second World War, though, there was this understanding that thing we did at the end of the first one, not a great idea. We probably don't want to do that again. So what do we do now that this traumatic event has happened? How do we approach peace in Europe? They hold a couple of conferences. They hold one in Tehran, they hold one in Yalta in Ukraine, and they hold the final one in Potsdam in Brandenburg. And in these conferences, they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? How do we approach the situation? They decide that if you want something done right, you just do it yourself. So that's what they were going to do. They were going to split the country up into zones of occupations, and they were each going to have a specific zone of occupation be under them, but they were also going to implement the principle of 4 Ds, which meant demilitarization, denazification, decentralization, and democratization. The big question, though, is who gets to pick what part of the country they want to go, who gets to go first in picking what part of the country they want. After several weeks of conversation, it was decided that the USSR would go first because they lost the most people during the Second World War. They lost between 20 and 26 million people in total. And to put that in context, the UK and the US individually lost about 0.5 to 1 million each. So 26 million people is a lot of people, right? So they go first and they get the biggest section as well, which meant they got about... All right. And then you have the Americans go next. And what is it universally known that Americans like? Good beer and good food, right? And you get all of those things in the South, Bavaria, and that's exactly what they get. About that much. And then the UK, it's gray, it's rainy, it's industrialized. Probably felt like home. There's a couple of ports in there, yeah. Feels very much wet like the UK. So they get the rest right here. And then you have the French. The French, always unhappy about something. And they felt like they also participated in the Second World War. So for the 2 weeks or so they did participate, it was decided they could get a participation award, which meant they got about this much. Looking at this map though, there's a literal hole in the map, right? And that's Berlin. It was said whoever has Berlin has Germany, and whoever has Germany has Europe. So essentially this would be like giving Europe to the USSR. So after several conversations, they decided, well, what we'll do is we'll just split Berlin up the way we split the rest of the country, meaning by the end of 1945, Berlin would have also looked like this. Alright, so there's probably a really big conversation we could have on the ethics of splitting a country up like this, right? This would turn it into a 6-hour tour, and we're not going to get into that. But what becomes glaringly obvious is that the West starts to do significantly better than the East was doing. It was considered an economic miracle how quickly they recovered from the Second World War. They implement a new currency, the Westen Deutschmark, that was really, really strong, stronger than anything that they had in the East. And what that means is a lot of people start to look to West Germany from East Germany and think, life looks so much better on the other side. Why am I toiling and troubling and suffering on this side when I can be on the other side and living lavish? That means is a lot of people start to move from the east and go into the west. During this period of time, up to the 1940s, you also have state buildings start to happen, where one side officially starts to call itself the Deutsch-Demokratische Republik, and the other side starts to call itself the Bundesrepublik of Deutschland, which would basically mean the German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic of Germany. Side note, if you have to put democratic in the name of your country, chances are it's probably not very democratic, right? But anyway, I also come from a country that has democratic in its name, so I can say that. Anyway, at this point you have state building happen, meaning you have a border that exists between the two sides, and officially they're two separate countries. But you still have people leaving from one end to the other. The first attempt from the Soviets at kind of starving out the Westerners from Berlin happens also in 1948, where they cut off any roads or trains or boats access that they might have had from West Germany into West Berlin. This is a really big problem because you have people in West Berlin that are dependent on the essentials that they were getting from West Germany, right? The Western Allies look at this and they're like, okay, well, we can't really dispute this because technically all of that is their land. However, what they can't do is split the sky up, right? They can't cut it in half. So what they resort to doing is using airplanes and sending airplanes from one end, from West Germany into West Berlin with things that people might have needed. It got really chaotic, got really crazy. It was every 90 seconds you were having an airplane being sent over from West Germany to West Berlin with things that people might have needed, like salt and sugar and flour and ketchup and curry powder and sausages, which is how we have currywurst. And if you have not tried a currywurst, try it to say you have, I guess. But you know, it's not the top of the most, you have to try foods in Berlin. I mean, but hey, try it. Anyway, that's also how we have air traffic regulation, because it was just so chaotic and they needed a way to keep up with everybody coming in. This separation, which we call the Berlin blockade, lasts about a year from 1948 into 1949 with airplanes being sent over. Eventually they do open up, the Soviets do open up a road allowing from West Germany into West Berlin so that they could get essentials from one end to the other. But you still have this problem of people leaving from one end to the other, right? So at some point it gets to 1,000 people a day that were moving from one end to go to the other side, and they lose about 20% of their population, which is really not great when it's your young doctors and lawyers and engineers to build you that TV tower and tour guides to keep you entertained, right? It's a really massive problem. It's also your young, able-bodied people that you need in a country when your country's just experienced a crazy war that's decimated a lot of them. So they're trying still to figure out how do we stop people from leaving. In comes a man by the name of Walter Ulbricht, who is known as the thinker or the architect of the wall, and he was actually the leader of the SED party in East Germany, which was the ruling political party at the time. And he proposes, why don't we just make it clear that East Germans have no access to West Berlin and West Germany. This was largely because that's how people were leaving. So if you're an East German, you'd go into West Berlin, you'd get your paperwork, and you'd make your passport, which would officially make you a West German, which would allow you to go into West Germany. So he proposes we should just physically cut off any access that Easterners have to the West. He was talking to Nikita Khrushchev at this point. He was trying to convince Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the USSR at this time. And Nikita Khrushchev wasn't too hot on the idea because, you know, the Cold War is bubbling up, the tensions are really intense. He didn't want to aggravate the West, but eventually he has to throw in the towel and says, go ahead, go through with it. But if at any point the people in the West have an issue with it, we're not going to push it. So that's how you have, in 1961, over 20,000 Soviet soldiers that go as close as they can to West Berlin, and with barbed wire, create a physical separation of West Berlin, essentially isolating it in the east right there. So that would have looked something like this. Alright, so to kind of give you an idea of how crazy that is, imagine if after the tour I'm like, wow, you guys are so fun. You should come over to my villa that I have in East Berlin. It's going to be a good time. I have barbecue on and, you know, it'll be great. And you come over and a couple of bottles of wine later, you look at the time and it's 3 a.m. and you don't want to drive back to your hotel in West Berlin. So you spend the night in one of my many rooms in my massive villa. And you wake up the next day and you're stuck there, essentially. For however long I'm okay with putting you up. And that's what happened to a lot of people. A lot of people lost their jobs also because they were working in the West but living in the East because the rent was cheaper on the one side but the pay was better on the other side. A lot of people woke up and they were separated from their families and they didn't know how long it was going to last. Well over 20 years does it last. And what you also had is a lot of young people that went partying in the East because the drinks were cheaper and the parties were better, and then they went to sleep in the East and they woke up essentially stuck there, right? It starts off with barbed wire in 1961, but between 1961 and 1962, they start to add concrete blocks. Between 1962 and 1965, you have the first version of the wall go up, and between 65 and 75, you have 4 different versions of it occur until you get the Grenzenmauer 75, which is basically the border wall 75, and that one lasts from 1975 all the way to 1989. And that's usually what people recognize as the Berlin Wall. I should also mention it wasn't just the one wall, but it was 2 walls with no man's land between the 2 walls, but we'll get a chance to go and check it out in a little bit. What's really cool about this area though is you can see where one of the walls would have cut across the road. The cobblestones that you see right there, one of the walls would have stood right there. So essentially what we are standing on right now would be East Berlin, and on the other side where the first thing you see is a KFC and a McDonald's is West Berlin, which is really ironic, isn't it? Anyway, Checkpoint Charlie. Who is Charlie and what does he have to do with this story and how do you get a checkpoint named after him? Checkpoint Charlie wasn't so much named after a person, it was named after the phonetic alphabet. I've also heard it called the military alphabet for some reason, but that's because you would have had 3 major entrances that would have led you from west into the east. The first one would have been Checkpoint A or Checkpoint Alpha that would have led you from West Germany into East Germany. The second one would have been Checkpoint B, so Checkpoint Bravo would have led you from East Germany into West Berlin, and Checkpoint Charlie, where we are today, would have led you from one Berlin to the other, so from West Berlin to East Berlin. Essentially, Checkpoint Charlie was originally for the American military personnel and diplomats that needed to get from one side to the other. Eventually, though, they start to open it up to Western tourists that would have liked to see what life on the other side of what was considered the Iron Curtain would have looked like. They would come down here, give their passport, get a stamp, pay a specific amount, go over to the other side, and then change money so that they could have money to spend. What's really funny, though, is, well, I think it's funny, the money that they would change, they were expected to use up whilst they were in East Germany. You couldn't take it back with you. So you had stories of Western tourists that would change money and then go over to the other side and realize that there wasn't really much in the stores. So they would go and try to spend all the money that they would have changed, and they would resort to going into bars and buying drinks for everybody in the bars because they had all this money that they would have to spend. So I think it must have been a really good time when the Westerners were in town, right? When tourists were around. In terms of Germans traveling from one end to the other, it was a little bit more complex. West Germans had an easier time going from one end to the other. They could go over, no problem. They'd get a little harassed by the soldiers, but most of the time there was no issue going through. In terms of East Germans though, you couldn't just go through because you wanted to, go visit your family, go have a good time or whatever. So a student who has no ties tying them to East Germany or East Berlin couldn't really go unless they had a really good reason, like representing the country or whatever. However, if you were a parent, if you were a mother, and you had children with you living in the East, and you had your own parents on the other side that you wanted to go visit, you could go, but you would have to leave your kids back in the East, so that it would be sure that you would come back. So a lot of caveats on who could go and why they could go and how long they could go for, so a lot more complex. The checkpoint would have also not looked like this at the time. It would have been a lot more intimidating and intense because it was a section where the American and the Soviet sector met up and they were the big actors in the Cold War. So, right, think guns and dogs and constant surveillance, nothing like it is today. Today's just to give us an idea of where it would have been. I'm pretty sure the original checkpoint wouldn't even have been down the street. They moved it for the sake of traffic, but originally it would have probably been down the street this way. I do want to give you a chance to go check out the checkpoint. Please remember that it is a tourist spot, so your belongings, be careful with them. I mean, we're not Paris, so nothing crazy will happen, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And also there's usually a bunch of guys that offer you to play 3-card Monty. You know, find the queen card around the corner. Please don't play. We've had someone lose like 900 euro trying to find that darn queen card. It's really not worth it. It's a scam. Let's see, what time is it? 23. Oof. I can give you a quick 4 minutes to just go and see the checkpoint, grab a quick picture, and then come back so we can move on to the next.